easy watercolor texture techniques. That's what we're looking at in today's video. So let's get started. I'm going to show you 7 really interesting texture techniques. I'm going to show you how to do them. I'm going to show you what they look like after they're dry, but a couple of things to consider. I'm doing them on white paper today, but you can of course layer these techniques on top of pre-painted layers of paint. You want to make sure those are dry first. Also, when I tell you to let these things dry, be aware that I'm talking about a significant amount of drying. Some of them are going to take, a few hours or even overnight to dry, so they're quite quick to do. But you have to remember, particularly with the ones where we're leaving things on top of the paper, they may not dry as quickly as paper that's just out in the open. So leaving these to dry a correct amount of time is absolutely vital, as is using certain types of watercolour. So you want to make sure that the paints you use are strong enough in colour. I've had people say to me sometimes, well, I tried that texture technique, Michelle, and it didn't work. And when I look at it, they just haven't used enough paint, they haven't used enough pigment, there's not enough colour basically to show up the texture. You also want to make sure that you're working on a standard textured watercolour paper, not a smooth or hot press paper. And the best type of pigments to use for texture techniques will always be granulating pigments, because those little granules that are heavier than the rest of the paint will settle into dips and around objects, and they'll just make everything look so much nicer, maybe combined with 1 or 2 staining colours too. So let's get started with texture technique number 1. And we're going to be using alcohol. Now, we're not going to drink it, although drinking it would lead to some interesting textures on your paintings, but we're going to actually apply it. So let's look at materials. The paper I'm on today is Fabriano Artistico Extra White. The paints I'm using are by Jackman's Art Materials. That's Jackman's, not Jackson's. And the brush is also by Jackman's, though it's quite an old one. I'm not going to use a best brush because some of these techniques are a little bit hard wearing, so you're best to use an older brush for things like this. I've got a standard cadmium yellow. Cadmiums always granulate very slightly. Then we've got a burnt sienna. I've got some ultramarine here, and in this little pot there is some perylene maroon. If you're wondering why it's in a small pot with a handwritten label like this, it's because it's a manufacturer's sample. So these are the colours I'm going to be using today, hopefully for some good effects. So let's do our first technique, and we're going to be using alcohol. So in here I have got a little bit of alcohol. Now you want to use a pure alcohol for this. So you can use a rubbing alcohol, but you can also use gin or vodka, and this is gin. I don't even like gin. Occasionally people leave things in my house. I guess that's one of those occasions. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a little pipette with this. At a push you can just drip it from a paintbrush, but I'm going to use a pipette simply because I've got one to hand. Now, timing is everything with this technique. You need to drip it into wet paint, but not paint that's literally just gone down. You need to wait till it's sort of starting to dry, so you want that kind of semi-dry damp effect. I'm just going to put random colours on here just so that we can see how it affects the paint, and we're going to let it get semi-dry, so it's going to be damp, and then we're just going to drip the alcohol in. So it's starting to dry now, the wet sheen has gone off of it, and I'm just going to get a little bit of this alcohol and just going to literally drip it carefully onto the paper like so. Now, it doesn't always look as spectacular as this when it dries, but I'll let them dry completely and you can see what it does in the end. And by the magic of editing, let's take a look and see what we've got when it's dry. So here it is after it's dried. You can see here how I had too much water up here and it hasn't worked as well. I mean, something has still happened, but it's probably because I'm working on unstretched paper as well. I usually work on stretched paper, and it reduces the buckling so the paint doesn't sit in as many dips. But you can see these really fun sort of donut type circles that we've got here. I think they look really, really pretty. They're a great alternative to the bokeh technique if you've seen that one as well, and a lot quicker to do. So for technique number 2, we're going to use this stuff, bubble wrap. Now be aware, of course, that any time that you're using some kind of disposable plastic item for any of my video techniques, you can of course just rinse them clean under the tap, let them dry and reuse them. So let's not damage the environment, but I'm sure you've probably got some of this stuff laying around somewhere. We don't even have to purchase it. It just ends up in our houses. But it does make a really cool texture technique. Let me show you how it's done. So I've cut myself a little square of this bubble wrap. Now, unlike the alcohol, we need to put this on when the paint is very wet. So we're going to pop some paint on again. And what we're going to need to do is weigh this down. So you're going to need to weigh it down with something that's got enough weight to keep it pressed into the paper, but isn't so heavy that it's going to prevent it from drying. I mean, don't go over the top with it, you know, don't be chucking a house brick on it or anything like that. So let's get some paint on here. As I said, nice and wet. We don't want to weight with this one. I'm going to place it on the paper. Be careful not to move it from side to side. Just place it down and leave it alone. You're never going to get 100% control with these techniques, but seeing how they turn out with different papers and different temperatures, these are some pattern weights that I've got because I'm into dressmaking. Seeing how it turns out under different circumstances is part of the fun of doing these techniques. So I'm going to place this here. Anything where you're putting plastic on top of the paper is going to take a very long while to dry. I know it's difficult, but try not to peel things up and have a peek and see how it's getting on. Just leave it for a few hours. So this cling film has actually been left overnight to dry. As I said, it takes an awful long while with the plastic not letting the air get in, but everything dries in time. So let's remove the weights and lift up. And we've got some really, really fun patterns going on here. Depending on the pigment used and the pressure will depend on the results that you get. So let's go through one of the most popular things that you can add to your watercolour paint, and that's salt. Results with this one will vary depending on things like humidity, the type of salt you're using. You want to use large granules if possible. But let me show you how it's done and give you a few tips for success. So for this next one, we're going to apply it while it's wet again, but then we're going to adjust it a little bit. So I'm going to start with the lighter colour here. I'm going to start with the yellow. Let's put a little bit of blue in there so we get some greens as well. So you want chunky salt for this. You want rock salt or sea salt, which is what I've got. And we're going to sprinkle it on to the wet paint. Try not to be too even with it. Just let it fall where it wants. And I'm going to give it a moment or so, and then I'm going to drip extra paint on it because that's going to help to get a stronger effect. If you are lucky with this technique, you'll get some beautiful crystallized shapes forming. If not, you may just get some small marks on the paper, but that's nice too. As I said, the fun of these techniques is just waiting and seeing what happens. I'm going to get wet paint now. I'm just going to, without disturbing the salt too much, I'm going to drip it around. You can also, at this stage, if you want to, just add clean water. I mean, I'm using the term clean, it's not entirely clean, but it is water from my jam jar. Now see where these bits are on the yellow here. Yellow isn't really dark enough to show them up, so I want to make sure that we've got some colour in there. So we have the yellow, but also we've got some other colours going on. You can do this with one colour or two colours or many colours, just as you please. And then again, you're going to leave it alone. Now you can use table salt or sand or anything fine grained, but you'll get a very, very minimal effect. The larger the pieces of salt, the more dramatic it's going to look. Now I'll show you it in a moment when it's dry. And what we need to do is brush those crystals off because they're going to be stuck, but not too firmly. If there are any tiny, tiny pieces stuck to the paper, then an eraser will usually shift them. So here's our salt once it's dried. The results you get with this do vary an awful lot depending on pigments, humidity, all sorts of things. Now to get this off, you can see it's stuck fairly firmly. Just going to need to brush it. I wouldn't normally be doing it on a flat surface like this. I'd have it tipped over a dustbin, and you're just gonna brush everything off. And if anything's left that won't remove, you can use an eraser. A firm eraser is better than a putty eraser. These were actually pretty stubborn. I had to get my fingernail under some of them. You can see we've got a range of shapes here. So we can see in places we've just got the shapes of the actual salt granules themselves. And then in other places we've got more crystallized marks. The results for this technique do vary. I'll put up a photograph of another example. Next up, we're going to do a great fun technique involving bleach. Now, before any of you go into the comments and ask me if bleach damages your watercolour paper, the short answer is yes, it does. So you want to use these techniques for things that are a little bit more fun, perhaps greetings cards, something like that. They're not going to damage your paper in the next 2 weeks, but if you're thinking of, a fine art painting that's archival and going to last for centuries, then don't be putting bleach on it. But nevertheless, this is a great fun technique. It'll look a bit different every time you try it. Let me show you how it's done. So I'm back to the pipette again, but I don't have alcohol this time. I have a solution of 50% bleach, that's household bleach, and 50% water. So I've added some water just to minimise the amount of damage to the paper. As I said, you wouldn't use this for archival work, but you don't want to get too hung up on damage to paper because literally anything can damage your paper. Here in the south, in the UK, we have very, very limescale-y water. There's lots of limescale in the water. I probably should use distilled water for painting. Of course, most of the time I don't. We're going to do the same thing here in that we're going to allow the paint to get sort of semi-dry before dripping the bleach on. Now, some rules for working with bleach. I've got, less than a thimbleful and it's already sort of hitting the back of my throat. Make sure that a window is open when you're using it. Make sure you dispose of anything that's left straight away afterwards. Pour out as little as you can. It's not wonderful for the environment. You don't want to be dumping large amounts of it down the drain. It is possible to put it in a spray bottle. You can spray bleach onto your work. Now, I want you to only do that if you're literally outdoors. I used to do some of these techniques with my art classes and I only allowed them to spray bleach, and that would be a 50% bleach solution again if we were physically outside, if the weather was nice enough that we could go outdoors. So again, you're just waiting until the sheen has gone off of it and it's semi-dry, and then we're going to drip. So I think that the top here hadn't dried as much as the rest, so that's spreading a little bit further, but nevertheless, it's an interesting experiment. Let's put one more down the bottom here, and then by the magic of editing, we'll have a look at it when it's dry. So here's our bleach when it's dried. You can see that you get these kind of feathery marks appear. Now this part here was where the paint was a little bit drier and it's worked a little bit better. Up here where the paint was wetter, we see that we have less control, but there's some really interesting effects here. I think this would be quite suitable for some kind of galaxy painting. For our next texture technique, this is one of my favourites, it gives such amazing results. We're going to use what we call here in the UK cling film. In other countries you might call it plastic wrap, you might call it saran wrap. We're all trying to reduce the use of this stuff, aren't we? But just like the bubble wrap, you can actually rinse, dry and reuse for art purposes. So the cling film is another one that needs to be applied to quite wet paint. And again, the colour needs to be strong enough so that the folds will show as they dry. Now you can weight this one down, but personally I don't usually feel that I need to. Depends on the sort of wrap you've got, I guess. They're trying to make them all more environmentally friendly these days, which is a good thing obviously, but it does mean that some of them are a little less sticky. So very wet paint here. You can take your wrap and just make sure it's, nicely scrunched up, and then you're just going to press in. Just push it down a little bit. And again, be careful not to sort of wiggle it about, just press it straight, and then we're just going to leave it to dry. So here's our cling film dried off, and look at this. This, as I said, is one of my favourites. I think these are really, really interesting kind of geometric marks that you get. Again, it's going to vary a huge amount depending on what pigments you've used, but I often use this one for backgrounds. I think it's really, really interesting. You can even make it look, if you put a few layers over the top, you can make it look like cracked plaster and all sorts of other surfaces. Next up, we're going to use a pencil. Yes, a pencil, but we're not going to draw on the paper. Now, if you own such a thing as an embossing tool, an embossing point, or one of those nail art tools with the little blunt point, you can use those instead. But I did promise you that this would be a video using household items. So we're going to use a pencil to emboss. Let me show you how it's done. But you can, of course, use an embossing tool if you prefer. This technique is fantastic if you've got something very specific you want to transfer across, like dots, stripes, or even text. So I've got a pencil here. The point is not too sharp, it's fairly blunt, it's a reasonably hard pencil, And I've got some tracing paper here. Now, this will actually work with printer paper. Of course, you won't be able to see through it, which may be a disadvantage if you need to put a particular pattern next to somewhere that you've been working on your paper. But if you're not worried about that, then printer paper will work too. Just make sure the paper is thin enough because you're going to indent or emboss the paper. You can also use an embossing tool like this one. If you have one, they sell these for nail art as well as for art. They're very, very cheap. But if you've got a pencil, then that will do too. And all you're going to do is just make whatever pattern you want, and you're going to press really quite hard because you're looking to dent the paper. And what will happen is that the paint, as it goes onto the paper, especially if you're using granulating pigments, is the paint pigments are going to be attracted to the dents. You can do all sorts of things. We can do dots and circles as well. And the paint is going to sit in the dents, and hopefully it's going to make it look a bit darker. You see how accurate you can make it as opposed to some of the techniques we've done thus far. You can also do text with it, which I'll show you in a moment. So let's pop our paint on the paper, and you can see the little dark marks coming up there. Now, you don't want to go too dark with the paint. You can see that these are quite faint. You may find that you see them as the paint is wet and then they disappear as the paint dries. All you want to do is put another layer on and more pigment will settle in those dips and begin to appear. The other thing you can do, whilst it's damp and you can actually see where you've drawn, is you can go round and press a little bit harder, and you can make these appear a little bit darker, like so. Now, of course, you don't want to do that with a pencil because you'll be getting graphite on the paper, but you absolutely can use any hard point that isn't sharp, including a ballpoint pen that's run out of ink. Now, I promised I'd show you how to do text. So what you can do is you can get your text, print it off on the computer or just handwrite it, and then you can emboss through that paper. Make sure it's printed on thin printer paper. You can emboss the paper so that your words appear as you put the paint on. So let's see how that looks. Of course, it doesn't have to be text. You can do it with pictures as well. It's actually a great way of sort of making magic pictures with the grandchildren, or just secret messages like this one. It's a little bit faint at the moment. I'll put another couple of layers of paint on it, and hopefully this very special message will appear. So here's our pencil embossing, and you can see that I put another layer of paint over the top. The more layers you put on, the more the pigment will sit into the dips, but you can go too far with it, then it goes too dark and covers up, so sometimes you have to wash it out again. This is a technique that needs a little bit of adjustment, so just layering and removing layers or washing her with water until you get the right amount of depth of tone and you can still see the marks made. And what about the writing that we did? Well, look at this. Here we have this nice hidden message. Don't forget to like the video. Now, our last one is really good fun. We're going to be using pebbles. Now, before I show you how to apply these to your paper and to leave the texture with them, be aware that anything that you leave to dry in watercolour paint will leave some kind of mark. So other things you could try include coins, paper clips. You can use sequin, waste and mesh. You would probably need to weigh it down a little bit in that case. You can even use lentils and rice, but we're going to use pebbles. Let me show you how this technique works. So here I've got some pebbles. Yes, I did just pick them up from my garden. Obviously I'll put them back before I leave because I don't want the landlord charging me for theft. So we're going to drop these into wet paint, and of course I have washed them. You want to wash and dry them first. And again, let's apply our colours nice and strongly. I'll show you as well, after this one's dry, an example I did with some rice. So anything you drop into your paper is going to leave some kind of impression. And pebbles being large can be really quite fun. So all I'm going to do is just drop them on while the paint's wet and allow them to dry. They look best if you do quite a few and put them fairly close together, but of course you can experiment. If you just wanted them spaced out, you could do that too. Let's see how they look once they've dried. Lastly, our pebbles. So let's take them off and see what we've got. There we are, some interesting little marks. Now again, this one varies hugely. I've seen much more extensive results than this. I've done a couple of other samples so you can see how it looks sometimes. So here we have one done with pink and blue. This one worked pretty well. These were more staining pigments actually. And I think that's a really interesting result there. Look at this one here. What I did this time was I placed the pebbles on dry paper and I dripped paint around them and then sprayed with water. So you can also use it as a kind of resist, so you get these unusual shapes left in the white paper. As I said, there are all sorts of things that you can drop onto your paper in order to make shapes. What about this one? These were rice grains, but before I dropped them onto this wet yellow surface, I dipped them in some phthalo blue paint. Remember, with porous things like rice and lentils, just to drop them in the wet paint quickly. Don't leave them soaking in paint for ages, otherwise you're really just making vegan sushi. So the techniques we've done today are only a small fraction of the texture techniques that I know. Do let me know if you'd like more videos like this one. I do read all your comments and I do take on board your suggestions. I also have a full online course all about watercolour textures, and the previous one to that is just about basic watercolour techniques. You can find a link to all of my courses, including one of my most popular ones, which is my beginner's drawing course, down in the video description. You'll also find links to my Facebook group and my Patreon membership community. If you'd like to get more in-depth weekly tutorials, paint-along tutorials, that's the place to go. In the meantime, if you do need a little bit more help with your drawing, do watch this next video. It's going to tell you all about the top 10 drawing mistakes that I see people make. They're really easy to fix. You can watch that video right now.